Good morning. It's 3 minutes after 10, and I am going to begin the programme today with a topic for which I have no news-based source. Now, by that, I mean it is in the news, but it's not in the news in the way that I want to talk about it today. This is an extraordinarily courageous way to approach radio. I'm going to ask you a question, and I have no way of checking on your answers or even ensuring that they are relevant to the bigger picture that we seek to explore together. It is, yesterday, I don't know if you were listening. If you weren't, and that's not very nice, is it, frankly? I don't do this for my own amusement. But yesterday we were flirting with the idea of adding HS2 to the list of topics about which we will never talk again. There were some interesting moments during the course of the conversation and some interesting contributions, but it just seemed for a while to be veering into, sort of parking tickets and smart motorways territory. And I found myself thinking there are reasons why we don't do these conversations. We don't take 10 calls in succession, which are all completely interchangeable and identical. And then everything improved, thankfully. Partly for surreal reasons, with reference to the Romans. I don't know if you heard that. That was a marvellous contribution from Raymond in Uxbridge, suggesting that we should have built HS2 according to the Roman road method of traversing nations. And other contributors were similarly informed. So we're going to talk about it again today, but not in the way that you might expect. Because the more I've looked at this story, the more I have found myself marvelling at how much it is costing. And it is a sense of wonder leavened by familiarity. I don't really like narratives of us being really bad at stuff. The bad things about this country have been deliberately or accidentally inflicted upon us. There's nothing in our DNA or in our waters, literally, of course, these days, that is by necessity and by definition suboptimal or bad. Our waters are filthy because of people and individuals and institutions pumping shocking amounts of sewage into them. The ability to export, the difficulties of exporting to our nearest markets have been put in place by politicians who promise to remove red tape. There is nothing sort of fundamentally or inherently British about decline and damage, but there does seem to be about cost. Whenever a massive public project is announced in this country, it always seems to cost a hell of a lot more than they told us it would. And indeed, I think, and this is where I have done what we might laughably describe as some research, it always seems to cost a hell of a lot more than it would in other countries. Now, there are things relevant to HS2 that are specific to Britain. We're a particularly built-up country. I mean, there's lots of areas of the country that aren't built up. I think there's more of the United Kingdom covered in golf course than there is in housing. But when you want to put a railway between towns and cities, then you're going to have to build in towns and cities. And that, of course, is incredibly costly. But I don't think any of these specifics explain why building infrastructure in the UK costs far more than in most other places, okay? So France opened a 188-mile stretch of its high-speed network in 2017. It cost, in today's money, it cost £46 million per mile, okay? £46 million per mile. The HS2 at the moment, per mile of track, is knocking at the door of £396 million per mile. I mean, this is the stuff. No wonder they're desperate to talk about refugees again. This is the stuff of what is it the stuff of? It's the stuff of wonder. You would imagine, wouldn't you, that somebody might be pointing this out in a slightly louder voice than we can muster on this little radio entertainment. £396 million, 400 million quid a mile, give or take. Some loose change. £400 million a mile to build HS2, hop over La Manche, swim across the English Channel to France, and high-speed rail per mile. It's a high-speed rail network. There might be some differences, but they won't account for this. In a figure adjusted for inflation, so in today's money, and this is a calculation undertaken by, I think, one of the most valuable contributors to public discourse in this country, John Byrne-Murdoch of the Financial Times, in France, it cost 46 million per mile. In Britain, 396 million per mile. In France, 46 million. And there it is. Just over a tenth as much. And it took 12 years to deliver from the start of planning to the trains actually running. HS2 anticipated for the same initial phase, to take 23 years. So it's taking twice as long and costing 10 times as much. HS2 specifically. Steve has already been in touch with a question that's possibly better than the one I was going to ask you. He says, one question, James, where the hell is that money going? It's a very good question, Steve. I live in a city, where Boris Johnson spent tens of millions of pounds on a bridge without a single brick ever being laid. And then he became Prime Minister after that. Such is the nature of our country. Such is the nature of the relationship between right-wing media getting very, very worried today about people not being able to afford their school fees. But, of course, people who can't afford food or energy bills or shampoo, they're just a bunch of feckless, work-shy scumbags who should, frankly, just get another job or take culinary advice from 30p Leenock. But the idea that Boris Johnson could spend tens of millions of pounds on a bridge that not only doesn't exist, but doesn't exist in any meaningful sense. It's not like half a bridge, which is what Rishi Sunak is keen to turn HS2 into, like sort of the equivalent of building half a bridge and claiming that half a bridge is better than no bridge. There's not like, I don't know if you've been to London recently, but it's not as if you can walk down to Embankment and see the beginnings of an abandoned bridge, like an abandoned garden bridge. Oh, look, there it is. Everyone's come down from Stockport to come and see the abandoned bridge. There's the abandoned bridge there. Oh, imagine if it had been built and it was going to be a garden bridge. It was going to be a bridge with a garden on it. 52 billion? Million, not billion. Don't relax, all right. Million, was it? 52, 35 million? I forget. Most of it ours. Most of it our money. Some of it private. But they didn't lay a single brick. They spent tens of millions of pounds without a single blade of spade breaking a single inch of London clay. And we sit here going, oh yeah, 400 million quid per mile of HS2. Where does it go? And listen, this is representative of a wider pattern. If you look at a dozen major rail projects, all adjusted for inflation, you're looking at about £262 million per mile in this country. Japan has something called a bullet train network. It's a rather good Brad Pitt film set on a bullet train, actually. I don't know if you've seen it yet, but it's a jolly good film. It may even be called Bullet Train. Is it called Bullet Train? I think it's even called Bullet Train. I enjoyed it enormously. They have brought in their per mile network for £145 million. So, again, £100 million per mile less than what we are paying. In Sweden, it's absolutely record-breaking 92. Well, I say record-breaking, it's not. £92 million per mile in Sweden, £74 million per mile in Italy, £42 million per mile in France, and £34 million in Germany. This is across a dozen different projects. So you can get a figure for a specific project and then you can get the average for that country. Roads are the same. New motorway bridges in the UK cost more than 3 times as much per lane per mile than they do in France, Denmark or Norway. If you want to put an additional lane on an existing road, it will cost you twice as much here as it does in Germany. In America, it's even higher, which may be relevant. It may be pertinent. I don't know. We shall see. And that, I've got more as well. I've got graphs. Of all the things that don't work on the radio, is there anything more apposite than graphs? Anything more apposite than graphs except, I don't know, facial expressions? Facial expressions don't work on the radio, but this show is available on YouTube now. I've developed a terrible habit of looking straight down the camera whenever I remember the YouTube show. It's going to be quite spooky. Don't let your children near it. YouTube! It's sort of curiously like a moth to a flame. But I've got some graphs that look at high-speed rail, new tram lines, the electrification of existing rail, new road tunnels, new motorway bridges, and new road lanes. And with the exception of America on quite a lot of these measures, and this might be part of the answer to the question that I'm about to ask you, the most obvious comparisons with countries like France, Germany, Japan, we are miles and miles and miles ahead of them on how much it costs. Do you know what? We're practically world-beating on paying money hand over fist for infrastructure that other countries manage to provide at a fraction of the cost that we pay. And it's useful to use France and Germany as examples because none of the weirdos and liars are going to be able to claim that it's somehow a consequence of having to follow European Union regulations or rules. Or I notice they've gone very, very quiet at the moment. I'll ask you a question in a minute, just a little bit of business first. I don't normally do this sort of thing, but something about Tanya in Westminster's message caught my eye. She says, from one O'Brien to another, please could you let my husband know I love him muchly. It's our 21st wedding anniversary today, so please could you thank Jason for being a wonderful husband with whom I am looking forward to spending another long and colourful stretch. Yes, I can, and congratulations to Tanya and Jason on their 21st wedding anniversary. But the question that I would rather you focused on today, as opposed to requests for shout-outs, as I believe the kids call them. The question is this. Why? 0345 6060 973. I'll do it again now in a slightly different tone of voice. Why? 0345 6060 973. Why does it cost so much more money here to build stuff than it does almost everywhere else? Brackets except America, dash, possibly relevant, close brackets. Why? And listen, I'd rather, at least to begin with, that we left the Romans out of it. And also, you must know what you're talking about to start with. I like to feel that I have covered the don't know what we're talking about bases fairly clearly. I've given you some numbers. I've given you some comparisons. These are not opinions. These are facts. They are figures. They are undisputed. But they do not address the question of why. Why does building, we'll start with railways, but infrastructure in general, why does it cost so much more to do it in the United Kingdom than it does almost anywhere else? And I'll take whatever answers you've got. And if you've worked on projects like this, then you might know. I think if I were to get political for a moment, I would suggest that you need good governance to bring in projects like this. In other words, you need big government. You need a big state. You need governance. You need public figures, civil servants watching and managing and keeping an eye on things rather than just letting the private sector run off and spend whatever they want on whatever they want. But I stress again, I don't know what I'm talking about. So that may just be wrong. If you hit the numbers now, you will get through. What's it going to be? Hospitals, a lot of you sending me figures regarding hospitals. Why does building infrastructure cost so much more in this country than it does in other comparable and nearby economies? 0345 6060 973. 19 minutes after 10 is the time. And there's another graph, actually, that looks at the quality of service for cities when it comes to public transport. Britain's cities are more poorly served by public transport than those of any other wealthy Western country, including the US, which comes in a close second. This all comes from OECD, functional urban areas with population above 250,000 research undertaken by John Byrne-Murdoch at the Financial Times. But it is the graph that looks at everything from railways to tram lines, from road lanes to motorway bridges, and for our purposes this week in the UK, high-speed rail that really begs the question, why does it cost so much more here than it does in other countries? Let's start with Michael, who's in Kings Lynn. Michael, what have you got?
Hello.
Hello.
So I've worked on a lot of government projects, right from military, right through to treatment plants, all sorts of different things. And unless it's got a very good manager on there who can cut through the red tape, these projects just go massively overboard because they put so many hurdles in front of themselves.
Like what?
Just paperwork stuff. So.
Well, this is going well. I think that's the communications infrastructure in the country letting us down there. I don't know whether it was brought in under budget, over budget, or with no budget at all. It is, as I say, the comparisons with other countries that are absolutely staggering, and phrases like red tape, not necessarily helpful without specific detail. Frank's in Manchester. Frank, what would you like to say?
Hi there, James.
Hello, Frank.
I am going back now 22 years. I was an ex-railway surveyor made redundant on privatisation.
Okay.
I popped up in the private consultancy world doing compulsory purchase because the particular company involved had taken on a section of the M60 where there were 32,000 Part 1 compensation cases.
Right.
Part 1 is where you own property close to a new piece of public infrastructure, but you don't have any property taken. You can put in a claim for compensation.
Okay.
And like I say, there were 32,000 of these. I'd never done Part 1 in my life. Can I help? So, of course, roll your sleeves up and you go. And I realised that it had the intellectual quotient of shelling peas. There was no skill to it at all.
Right.
After about a week, I asked my chief, is there a budget for this?
Yeah.
And he looked at me blank. And I said, I've stood on enough mats in front of enough secretaries of state to know that somebody somewhere has put a budget on this. What is it?
Yeah.
Oh, can you give us a budget?
So you've got 36,000 people waiting for compensation, and nobody anywhere has put a number on what the total is likely to be.
Well, not in that consultancy anyway. Anyway, I very rapidly compiled a budget.
Yeah.
£180 million.
Million?
£180 million.
Yeah.
Queue backsides running for cover in every direction.
Right. What are you telling me? Listen, I need the edited version, Frank. What are you telling me?
I know this is the trouble because it's fairly complex. It's not.
No, don't talk to me like I'm stupid. Well, you're telling me that they don't know how much compensation they're going to have to pay when they announce the project. So there's a massive hole.
In that case, yes.
Right, fine.
But,
well, that would work for HS2, wouldn't it? Because that was one of the first stories we started hearing was all about compulsory purchases and things like. It would be quite hard to put a figure on stuff like that. But what do they do in other countries? Do we know?
I have no idea because I kept the argument within this country. But when we looked at it, I then realised that branches of the same consultancy were doing different things around the country.
Yeah.
So I asked for a conference, which was refused, and we ended up with a whole hour on the telephone. But I managed to identify the fact that if you look at it like a slice of orange peel, 20% bang up on the boundary,
right?
0 at the point where you can no longer hear the new motorway, runway, whatever it is.
So we give too much compensation.
What was happening here, they took a straight line from the top to the bottom.
Right.
Whereas other offices were making it look like an orange peel section, 20% on the front line, dropping like a stone,
right,
and then zeroing out to the distance.
Not an orange peel, an orange segment.
An orange segment. And everything within that segment was wasted.
You just threw me. I'm sitting here drawing orange peel, Frank. And you mean an orange segment? You mean a pyramid?
I'm sorry, I do. I'm being thick, James.
No, you're not being thick, Frank. You're just you got your orange peel mixed up with your orange segments, and you've thrown the whole thing into disarray, mate.
But basically, every pound that comprised that segment was wasted public money.
And so this is going to be part of it, and albeit your experience is specific to a different project. It is on my graph. I've got new roads, new motorway bridges. So the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing would be one way of putting it.
I got the chance to move on to a new scheme with another. This was a local authority that hadn't even been started.
Right.
It was a tiny scheme, 3.2 million, but it was virgin. So I rolled my sleeves up. And I did the assessment. There was £3.2 million worth of claims in.
Right.
And I worked out the assessment at 110,000 quid.
Gosh.
So I called in the claimants' surveyors, stood them in the middle of the road that had been diverted.
Yes.
And after 10 minutes, told them they'd all lost the claims because if they'd stood there 2 years ago, they'd have been mown down by an 18-wheeler.
You're veering again, which is fine. So, in answer to Steve's question, which I think is better than mine, where did all the money go? Did it? I'm still not quite clear. And don't mention oranges.
The money went in overpayment of compensation.
Okay, that's interesting. And you're never going to find anyone complaining about that unless we get lucky and you ring in, because no one's ever going to ring in and say, I got far too much compensation for my house.
Well, like I say, in this case, I reduced a £3.2 million compensation bill to 110,000 quid, basically by putting me toe in the door and saying...
No, okay. No. And that's you acting autonomously, really. I mean, there's no one... You're not getting a slap around the chops from your boss, metaphorically speaking, if you don't do that. And in fact, if everyone else is failing to do it, you probably become a bit of a troublemaker on the team. And it's like, oh, Frank, wind your neck in, will you? The rest of us are just phoning it in. So that's not going to explain all of it, but it's going to be perhaps part of it. And how does the... situation get addressed? How do you improve that? Or how do you know how widespread it is? Why in France are you paying roughly a tenth of what you're paying here for a mile of high-speed rail network? It can't just be because of the way that compensation works, but if it is part of it, then I want to know more. 03456060973. An awful lot of you are getting in touch to tell me that Stanley Johnson benefited from a compensation scheme, Boris Johnson's father, but I don't know that would account for all of the shortfall or difference between building high-speed rail networks here and building them elsewhere in the world. Thank you, Frank. Staying up north. Simon's in Leeds. Simon, what do you want to say? I'll take anything you've got on this. It's an absolute blooming mystery.
I've been in construction all my life, James. From being 16, I'm 56 now. I drive cranes. That's what I do for a living.
Oh, mate, one day.
The big ones in the sky is what I do.
Is it it as enjoyable as it looks?
Oh, it's fantastic.
Do you love your work?
Lovely shots of it. Yeah, absolutely adore it, mate.
I bet you do.
I've seen some beautiful dawns and some fantastic sunsets.
I can well believe it. I don't know why.
I get views of cities that people paid for.
Yes, I know. And, well, most of us will never see it, except perhaps out of an aeroplane window, and that'll be 10 times further away than you. There's something about cranes that speak to something in my soul, Simon.
Well, my grandfather was a crane driver. That's why I drive cranes myself.
Fantastic. So. I wanted to do the show up one once, but they couldn't get the insurance.
No, because they move about a bit, you see, and people tend to get a bit frightened that I've not been up before, you know.
Oh, that's right. Anyway, that's not what you rang in for. Why does it cost so much?
It's the big C word, James. It's the big C word. It's vested interest as well.
That's
the government. The government do not use.
You mean consultancies or corruption?
Well, that one, the second one. I don't like to use that in a public space. You know what I mean? There could be ramifications. You know what I mean?
Yes, go on. Tell me more.
But basically, they don't use civil servants. Civil servants just kind of write stuff off. They just look at stuff. You know what I mean? Bits and bobs.
Yeah.
They use private consultancies. These private consultancies work with the same old construction companies that do all the work.
Yes. So they don't.
The hospitals. They build the roads.
No, you do, and we can all name the companies.
And they're all involved in the blacklist of trade unions. They're all, you know what I mean? They're all in that. And you look at who they fund, who they donate to.
Well, we know who they donate to because one of the loudest voices complaining about HS2 being called off was the fellow that owns JCB, although we're not obviously suggesting any malfeasance on the part of any individuals or named individuals or institutions. But for people who don't know, how does that work? So an army of consultants come in.
Basically, the planning goes out, the planning permission goes out, what have you, so they get consultants in there.
Right. Yeah.
So they get a big, I can't name the company, there's one company that does...
No, don't name anybody, just talk in very loose terms. Talk in loose terms.
But they come in, do the planning consultancy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then it's passed on to a consultancy within that consultancy that does the construction side of it.
But what you
have is you've got the same major construction.
No, I know I understand that, but so everybody knows that they're massively inflating budgets, and
absolutely,
and no one does anything about it.
No, but nobody cares.
Because why would you? Everyone's laughing.
Why would you? We're all getting paid.
Everyone's laughing.
We're all getting paid.
But this is Great Britain. I thought this would happen in Italy with the mafia and things. This is happening in Leeds.
We have a quote. Well, what's the quote from Al Capone? There's no such difference between government and gangsters.
Yeah.
One and the same.
Did he say that? It's very clever.
That's a Capone quote, allegedly. A Facebook Capone quote.
A Facebook Capone quote. I love it. So, I mean, I feel like we're nibbling at the edges of answers to this question, but obviously part of the question then becomes, what is unique to this country? You're suggesting that we've got more of the seas, whether it's corruption or consultancies, vested interests. We've got more of it going on here than anywhere else, except
Absolutely.
America, which would make sense, oddly, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. It's the same in America. It's the same in the States. It's the same major construction players that do all the work.
And it makes no difference who's in power, because...
that makes no difference, because that's the cost.
Well, this is a uniquely depressing
conversation. That's what you'll pay.
This is a uniquely depressing conversation, isn't it? And in your game, everybody knows. It's like the biggest, worst-kept secret in the world.
Everybody in construction knows. And even kind of, like, you mean, the British Library was the great example. The British Library was the first major one that went massively over. I know guys that worked on that, a lot of guys that worked on that. And so they brought in, after the British Library, a set of regulations called the Construction Design and Management Regulations, CDMs.
Right.
Yeah. Which was supposed to negate that. Yeah.
It didn't work.
So it was supposed to negate. Well, the reason it was. Well, no, because what it brought in was the advent of consultants.
Oh, I see. So you need to bring a consultant in to make sure you're not going over cost.
Boom.
But then you go over cost. No one ever gets fired. Well, I tell you what, Simon, that is an absolute revelation for me. And it's not going to be the whole of the answer to the question. And obviously, it's a little bit simplistic just to keep hitting that figure in France, where it costs just under a tenth or just over a tenth per mile for building a high-speed railway of what it costs here. But you've got a disparity that big. You take any answer going. This is incredible stuff, and there's more to come. It's 10:33. Lottie Morley has your headline. 10:37 is the time. Loads of text coming in. Apologies that I will only be able to read out some of them, but this seems pertinent from B. The UK has a massive skills shortage and deficit, making it impossible to deliver complex infrastructure projects effectively. Under this 13-year Conservative government, there has been a failure to invest in skills, project planning, project management, procurement, consultancy management, and infrastructure delivery. Private sector consultants run rings around government and extract public funds. This Tory government also seems happy to overpay their donor mates and waste public funds. It doesn't help with this Tory government slagging off civil servants and managers all the time rather than investing in skills improvement. I'll take that, B, but I would add that when Labour are in power, I don't think that these massive infrastructure projects come in any quicker or cheaper. I could be wrong, but I don't think I am. The Severn Bridge, Siva tells us, came in 1967. It was on time and on budget. About £8 million. So something has changed. Of course, we should always mention the rise of the secretly funded think tanks operating on behalf of big business, vested interests, quite possibly construction companies paying their wages. They won't tell us who does pay their wages, but they are, of course, responsible for the idea that we should have less state, less government, and rely more on private sector. And arguably, this massive HS2 overspend is what happens when you put everything in the hands of the private sector. 10:38 is the time. Tony is in Abergavenny. Tony, what would you like to say?
Oh, hello, James.
Hello, Tony.
Yeah, and it's only might be part of the reason,
yes.
As I understand it. In France, their droit administratif is their way of controlling these things. What they do is they have a survey put out, and this is very simplified. They decide on a route, and then they listen to a few local bits and pieces, then they give out, everybody gets a letter and compensation and the date that the bulldozers move in. Whereas we tend to have days and weeks of hearings, then there's appeals, then there's sort of call-ins and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
They don't bother with that. They
so
that's the route.
I mean, in a way, that's quite tricky, isn't it? Because you don't paint a picture of the French system that many people would be envious of. The idea that
exactly, but
it drops through your letterbox, and it drops through your letterbox, and a week on Tuesday they knock your house down.
Yeah, it's a bit like was it Hitchhikers, wasn't it?
Yes, it is exactly like that. It's exactly.
But, yeah, it's very simplified, and if somebody else wants to ring in with a bit further, better in particular.
No, but you've got experience of France, have you? So that's what you're drawing on.
I was a departmental lawyer, and I did a lot with European law, and I worked in town and country planning for a while before I joined the police.
No, fair enough. I mean, it's obviously going to come as a bit of a shock to everyone that thinks we all obey the same laws and that they are imposed upon us from Brussels. But that would be a pertinent contributor to the problem. It's not a phone-in where someone's going to ring in and nail the whole thing. You're looking at a reason why it costs 10 times more here than it does in France. There's going to be loads of contributory factors. But the idea that we have a more costly planning process and a more complicated planning process because we set a little bit more store by ownership seems not just plausible, but also deeply, deeply pertinent. I'm now being told that the Severn Bridge was built and owned by the French, which just sort of makes you wonder why we don't get them to do everything. If they're doing it, unfortunately, bloody Brexit. But if they're doing it for a fraction of the cost in France, why don't we just get the French companies to come here and do it? I'm being glib, but not necessarily stupid. Thank you, Tony. Diane's in Tottenham. Diane, what would you like to say?
I'd like to talk about the Dutch polder model, which in the Netherlands and to some extent in other European countries, the government owns the land. So some of this about the way in which projects are developed and run is often because we see public-private partnerships here in the UK as the private sector will always deliver.
Yes.
In the Dutch system, because the government owns about owns most of the land, so people are really surprised because they think that, the Dutch system it wouldn't work here. But if the government owns the land, it invites the private sector to obviously to deliver projects. Like, for example, their high-speed line. It was bizarre because I was, travelling to and from the Netherlands for work, and in 1997 they agreed to build a high-speed line to link the Netherlands with, and it was delivered by 2009. After a 2-year delay, which the Dutch were so wound up about. How can it be delayed by 2 years?
How does the ownership side of it work? Because I don't know much about Holland. So the large swathes of the country are owned by the state, as it were, whereas everything here is owned by, bloody aristocrats again, isn't it?
Yes. Exactly. It's it's capitalism in another form.
But you own your house in Holland, don't you? You own. People own a field or something.
Absolutely, farmers own it. But the point is that the development value, what's called the development value, accrues to the state rather than to individuals. So what that means is that after the Second World War, and regeneration needed to happen, the government took control of land and development. And what the government does for owning the land is it prepares. Remember that most of the Netherlands is underwater if we didn't have dikes.
Yes.
Then they prepare land for development. So the government prepares land for development. And if, for example, in their high-speed line, they invited a consortium of the private sector to come up with plans to deliver it at a cost that they would have to agree to. But any increase in the value around that, around the line, went to the government, which meant that they could reinvest in other infrastructure.
Okay, I think I understand. And that again adds to the picture that we're getting of a strangely sclerotic country. But if I understand you correctly, Diane, this is all the fault of the Norman conquest.
Yeah. Well, it could be, yes.
So I was giving Raymond a hard time yesterday for bringing the Romans into it, but it turns out the Normans are to blame.
They certainly are, because of our pattern of land ownership.
Because we carved it all up and gave it to William the Conqueror's mates.
We certainly did. And in the Dutch model, remember, it's called the Dutch polder model, if anyone wants to look it up.
Polder.
But because the Dutch, the Dutch polders is about how they make their own land. The Dutch make their own land.
Of course they do, Well, to be fair, so do a lot of East Anglia. So
but the point being that the Dutch realised I would argue it goes back hundreds of years, but particularly since the Second World War, that unless they built the dikes, the Netherlands would be. Would you trust a private company to
build a dike? No, I wouldn't. No, and this notion of ownership, of course, is going to be tied up in history. I'm not even being silly when I talk about the Normans. You're looking at a country where everything is owned by a tiny, tiny number of people. So you want to build a railway right through the middle of it, then you're going to be dealing with ownership issues. And the fact that we've got a royal family, they own huge swathes of the country. They own it in a way that some governments, it would seem, can, if not supersede, then at least bypass. This is fascinating stuff, Dutch polder system. Thank you, Diane. So, there you've got a problem of undoing it. You probably couldn't undo it. I wonder how much money goes to landowners in the UK for having a railway built through their land compared to in France or indeed Holland, if indeed you can make a straight comparison. 10:45 is the time. Thank you for your recommendations on further listening and reading. One that I am already aware of, or certainly someone I am already aware of, is an Irish economist called David McWilliams, who does a brilliant podcast. He also organises the Dorky Book Festival, which is an absolute jewel in the... It's one of the main reasons why I still write books, is so that I can go to the Dorky Book Festival. And I'll be going next summer with the new one. Just a tiny bit too late for this year's. But he's got a podcast, the David McWilliams podcast. As an economist, I think he was one of the first people, one of that tiny number of people who saw the 2008 financial crisis coming. But he talks about the necessity of taking back control of public infrastructure projects. They need to be under the remit of the state, because if they're not in the control of the government, then who is keeping an eye on things? I know it sounds odd, but the alternative is what we've got going on here. And the countries that are bringing in these projects at a fraction of the cost that we pay are countries where the state has a much tighter grip on proceedings than it does here. And if you think that sounds odd, then just wonder why it sounds odd in Britain, in a country where the Tory government and the rancid think tank ecosystem and the right-wing media is constantly telling us that the civil service is bad, that the blob is bad, that we should be trusting more in private sector, give it all to the business. It's actually bonkers when you look at the success of the con. We're so far down the road that we can't even see the ends of our own noses anymore. What is the answer to a lot of these problems? Well, the answer is to have more investment in the state, a state infrastructure. Governance is the word that you want. Good governance. Keeping an eye on these projects rather than saying we shall outsource it. We shall outsource it to the private sector. So I'll retweet the link to that particular podcast. And I'd remind you that for all the talk of the Norman Conquest and the Dutch model, this doesn't just apply to building stuff. Indeed, as this text from Simon reminds us, pretty much every IT project instigated by the government goes over budget and over timetable, often spectacularly so. I think there was an NHS computer system, wasn't there? And he says, just look at the COVID test and trace, £37 billion for a barely functional system. So it's not going to be the nature of property ownership that explains the bulk of this. It's going to be the relationship between public and private sector, I think. Hayley is in East Grinstead. Hayley, what would you like to say?
Firstly, honour to speak to you, James. I've been trying for such a long time.
You're very kind, so you really are. But it's going to be a huge anticlimax for you. Let me apologise in advance.
Well, I'll apologise in advance as well then.
Thanks.
Okay,
yes.
So I've spent years working in IT, and I just wanted to use that as an analogy.
Yes.
Construction and stuff. Want to buy a new warehouse system. Before now, we've just written it all ourselves, so it does exactly what we want it to do.
Right.
Okay, great. Get a new system, talk to a couple of suppliers, bring one in. Yeah, we love this system. We want this one. But we're not going to change how we do things. We want you to recode this system over here, and you end up with hundreds, maybe thousands of little customizations to make it work exactly how you want it to work. So it costs 3 times the amount of money.
So it's constantly going up. This is sort of reappraisal, I think it's called. It's built into the business model, but somehow the customers don't realise. That's the bit that confuses me. You'd think that once one person had pulled off something like this, then next time you order something, you're going to be on tiptoes, making sure it doesn't happen again.
Yes. So convert that to a construction thing.
Yep.
And being British, this is how we want to do it. We're not going to change how we want to do it.
It's a bit of exceptionalism, you think?
I think possibly.
Yeah, I do too now. You put it like that.
Raymond's idea yesterday. Sorry.
Yeah. No, what?
Instead of digging up half of Houston.
No, don't encourage him. There's no earthly way that HS2 should have been built like Watling Street.
No, not necessarily Watling Street, but maybe not dig up half of Euston and the surrounding areas and whatever else area we need to. Maybe there was a different or a better way.
Yeah, you've spoilt it now. It was going really well. But the point about digging up Euston is that that's already got a railway line to Birmingham. So if you're going to go from London to Birmingham, from Manchester to London to Birmingham, you have to go through the bit that was already going to Birmingham, I think.
Yes.
Or something like that. But what you're saying about this sort of built-in reappraisal, constant reappraisal, would be because the consultancies and the private private sector. I mean, there's a modicum of trust. There's an issue of trust here. So I hire you to come in and do something. It doesn't cross my mind that your top priority is rinsing me for as much money as you humanly can. But it is.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, I suspect our European and Asian cousins maybe don't have this kind of, this is the best way to do it. Let's do it this way. And
well,
next
also,
time
they
we
don't.
do another one.
Yes, of course. We won't learn
You know,
anything from the mistakes we made last time. And they've also got, they haven't got, almost all of the media essentially shilling for big businesses. The main governing party for the last 13 years, literally in the pocket of the kind of donors who are profiting enormously from the kind of projects that you described. The JCB bloke kicking off about the potential cooling of time on HS2 suddenly appears rather different from how it did at first glance. Hayley, thank you. I hope that lived up to your lofty expectations. Thank you for your lovely words. 10:55 is the time. Pete's in Bristol. Pete, what have you got?
Hi, James. How you doing?
Very well, Pete.
Sorry to take you off loudspeaker. So my dad and my sister both work in infrastructure, like national infrastructure projects. So I'm not an expert on this.
That's all right. No one is. And the ones that are won't tell us because they're the ones that are laughing all the way to the bank.
Exactly. So one of them's in communications, the other one's a lawyer.
Well, are you making a cake at the moment? Have you got a food mixer going on in the background?
No, just a kettle. I thought I'd have more warning before I came on national radio.
You put the kettle on. You got the kettle on while you're talking to me.
I thought your producer might come back and
That's
say...
That's absolutely ridiculous. Turn the kettle off this minute.
It is off. It is
there,
off.
now carry on.
Nothing in the background.
Thank you. Milk and 2 sugars, please.
So communications and law, and they both work for private companies.
I might just make a sandwich, actually. You just carry on talking. All
right. So they work for private companies, and the main client is the Department for Transport.
Yeah.
And they both take home quite good salaries for what in other countries I think would just be civil servants doing those jobs on a kind of set salary.
So it's outsourcing it, and presumably the bigger the project, the fewer companies there are that can be bidding for it anyway.
That's the nub of it.
Yeah.
That's really where it is. There's very few companies that can actually compete for these projects because they're so large.
And so we call them in and tell them to write their own bill.
Yeah, and when people talk about red tape in other countries, I don't know if they've ever dealt with red tape in other countries, but I've lived for a bit in Germany, and the bureaucracy there is insane. It is very difficult to get stuff done. I find it worse there than here, on a different sort of level, but I don't think it's red tape. I think it's
not
to do with outsourcing.
It's follow the money, Pete. Follow the money, and then you'll probably find your answers. And that's why Steve's question at the outset was the killer question to us: where does all the money go? And the answer is to the companies that are doing the work. And are they going to complain about being over budget and over schedule? No, of course they're not. The longer over schedule it goes, the longer they get paid for, and the higher over budget it goes, the more money they get. I found this a really surreal experience. I can't believe we've never touched on it before. Thank you, Pete. Brian's in Milton Keynes. Brian, what would you like to say?
Morning, James. Just along the lines of where does the money go?
Yes.
Very basically, in my view, there's two forms of contract, construction contract. Cost reimbursement or fixed fee.
Yeah.
Fixed fee is when you've got something fully designed. Picture a house. Your house is fully designed. There you go. From that, you derive a bill of quantities, which tells you each item. Cost reimbursement is the opposite. You really haven't got a clue what you want, but you want something to go in and make a start, ASAP. And I think that's the key. It's more, to get a true comparison, you would need a reasonable amount of design done first with things like some bills of quantity. So where did we overrun? Yes, there's a contingency in there for and that's what I think we're missing. But where is the visibility? What was the initial design? What was it based on? And
well, you're trusting the consultants on this. You do, because there's no one in the civil service that's got the expertise to do it anymore. Those days are gone, really. The I don't know whether it's austerity or ideology, but the idea that you'd have, local councillors and not councillors, but people working for councils, it's all being outsourced. All of it is outsourced to the private sector, so they're marking their own homework at every turn.
It is, but if you had something a bit more regimented,
also,
James,
yes, I agree with you. I agree. I think you're making perfect sense. I'd go further, Brian, and you tell me how plausible this is. But when we've got builders in, if they should suffer if things go wrong. They should make less money.
Exactly. sorry, James, it's about apportioning risk.
Yes, exactly.
So
that's the phrase I'm looking for.
If it comes in here that, okay, well, and that should be in the contract, to a certain extent, because that's what the contracts are, an apportionment risk. If it's lump sum,
so they're going to get their backsides in gear, aren't they? If it looks like it's going to be running late, they're going to get their backsides in gear. Lose some of the profit by paying overtime, so everyone's working through the night under arc lights, but it's going to come in on budget, because if it doesn't, it's going to cost us a hell of a lot more than it's going to cost us to make sure that it does.
Exactly.
Well, yeah, it is, you see. So, it's a very strange old business, this, isn't it? And the figures, when you look at it, comparing just the UK to France or to Germany or to Japan, are absolutely staggering. And yet, the UK public is being encouraged to get cross about all sorts of other things, not really about this. I don't know, what was the actual figure on the Garden Bridge? Because I think it's a really helpful illustration. Over £60 million, I think, of promised public money. I'm just trying to remember exactly how much was spent. But if you can preside over that, this is the United Kingdom and how they get away with it, not where does the money go. Boris Johnson can spend tens of billions of pounds on a vanity project that doesn't get built. And such is the nature of supine client journalism in this country that it's not even a bump in the road on his path to Prime Minister. It's 4 minutes after 11 now. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I should give you a quick heads up. We're going to have another one of our AI conversations at some point this week, possibly today, possibly not. I haven't decided yet. But do you remember when we sort of said it's going to kick off? It's going to be like that law about microprocessors. They will double in capacity and shrink in size exponentially. AI, even Rishi Sunak is warning about it. Two things drawing my attention to it. An incredible story involving Stephen Fry, which I saw earlier this week. I saw it last week. Because he recorded all of the Harry Potter books, his voice is there. And AI can therefore kind of make it sound as if he's voiced almost anything. I think he found a history documentary that was essentially being narrated in his voice that he had absolutely nothing to do with. And another example of it, I saw Satnam Sanghera, the journalist and rather brilliant author. I'm delighted to say he's hosting my event in Birmingham in November for the new book. But Satnam finding that AI is being trained using his books without his permission as a database where millions of hours of authors' work is being exploited by big tech with zero payment to the writers. So there's a lot going on. And we said we'd have fairly regular catch-ups. And I would abandon my traditional habit of almost celebrating my own ignorance. And I did it again yesterday, not on the show, thankfully, but off air. I said, what's that? What's the difference between Google Docs and Google Notes? And my colleague said, well, Google Notes is essentially a spreadsheet. I said, you've lost me. I've got to stop. You've got to stop doing that, being almost like proud of how things you don't know about. It's a stupid condition. It starts with maths, doesn't it? It starts at school where you think it's not cool to be good at maths because you're all creative, man. It's absolutely nuts, that approach. And never too old to change. So that's on my list of things that I need to change. Now, I don't know if you're going to change my mind on the next subject. Let me get the rather obvious political points out of the way. There is something truly hideous, stroke hilarious. I don't know, is there a German word for something that's simultaneously hideous and hilarious? But you know the kind of 30p Lennox school of compassion, where if someone tells you they can't afford food, you attack them. Or if someone tells you they can't afford basic essentials, anyone who's ever been to a food bank will know that they value things that aren't food at least as highly as things that are, if not more so. Cleaning products for both body and house, body and home, are at an absolute premium in food banks. Our Morrison's does a wonderful scheme where you can see what's in the bags. You buy a bag that they've put together in conjunction with the local food banks to find out what's needed. And very, very often, things like toothpaste and toothbrushes and things like that a family will be in desperate need of. If you are of the 30p Lennox school of thought, then you treat these families and these people with a nice mixture of contempt, derision and scepticism. What's that you say? You can't afford food? Get a better job. What's that you say? You can't afford shampoo? That's disgusting. You're pathetic. I don't believe you. The combination of hideousness and hilarity is off the charts because exactly the same people spit their dummies out when the Labour Party announces that it's going to put 20% VAT on school fees. working on the perfectly reasonable premise that private schools aren't charities and therefore should not have charitable exemption from VAT. It's mad that, right? Just that little point, that little comparison there. Find me someone that rages against poverty or denies poverty or pretends that poverty doesn't exist or just reserves a peculiar type of performative cruelty for people that are struggling. Remember the numbers we looked at yesterday? I'll probably get them the wrong way round. It's 9 million and 5 million who either have no savings or who have savings of less than £100. You've got no savings at all. You run out of money on the 28th and you're not getting paid until the 1st. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? Well, if you're lucky, you might be able to use a food bank. But the narrative, the Murdoch-inspired narrative of hating vulnerable people, attacking poor people, is a thing to behold, because exactly the same people crack out the violins when the Labour Party announces that it's putting 20% on school fees. Oh my God, how will people cope? I don't care about people who can't feed their kids or can't afford soap or shampoo, but my God, the idea that somebody somewhere might struggle to meet the school fees that they're currently paying, this is the stuff of armed... This is just unbearable. How? Oh, my days, you can't afford the school fees. I can't express how sorry I feel for it. What's that? You can't feed your kids? Sod off. What's that? You say you can't afford your school fees? Oh, that's terror. I mean, imagine how boiled your brain would have to be to arrive at a place where you think people complaining about an increase in school fees deserve more sympathy than people complaining about the cost of living, rendering them unable to meet the basic needs and provisions of their families. And at this point, it is customary to remind you that 40% of people on universal credit are in work, if not more. So I'm afraid those lazy Murdoch-inspired tropes don't work either. So that's the politics of it, right? Also, I will be affected by this Labour policy, and it will mean that I am spending more money as a consequence of a Labour Party policy than I am currently, in much the same way that if Liz Truss's mini-budget had gone through, I'd have been quids in. I did the sums. That was a mistake. I did the sums on how I would personally have been affected by Liz Truss's budget. It would have been easier for her to come around my house with a wheelbarrow full of money and just go, "Hello, James, I've got some money for you." And then she'd empty the wheelbarrow in the front garden and I'd send the kids out with bin liners to pick it all up. That is what Liz Truss's mini budget would have done for me. And guess what? I still think it was an absolute debacle designed effectively to enrich the people least in need of help while further impoverishing the people most in need of help. And that wasn't an accident. That was the policy. So here I am looking at the Labour policy to put 20% VAT on school fees, conscious of the fact that I will be affected by it and conscious of the fact that I can afford it, which means that if I was of a conservative bent and you were telling me that you're worried you won't be able to afford it, I'd just laugh at you and tell you to get a better job. That's what I would do, right? If I was right-wing and I could afford something and you were right-wing, left-wing or no-wing and you couldn't afford something, I would tell you to get on your bike. Is that the right language? What's that you say? You can't afford your school fees? Get on your bike, I say. Or, well, if you can't afford to pay your children's school fees, you shouldn't have had children in the first place. Have I got this right? Is that how it works? Is that how it's very easy, isn't it? No wonder it's such a popular position for almost every newspaper columnist in the country. You can't afford school fees? Well, you shouldn't have had children in the first place, eh? Should you? What's that you say? You can't afford school fees? Well, you need to get a better job, don't you? You need to work harder. You need to work harder. I don't care. What's that you say? 23 hours a day? Well, I think you'll find there's 24 hours in the average day. You should be working all of them. You can't afford school fees. Get on your bike, get a better job, and don't have children in the first place. Is that how it works? Those are the three things you say, isn't it? I think I've heard this happen. If someone can't afford food, well, you need to get a better job. You need to get on your bike. Well, if you can't afford food, maybe you shouldn't have had children in the first place. But if you can't afford school fees, crikey, roll out the red carpet, crack open the violin, start the symphony of sympathy, because compassion starts here. That's absolutely insane. Think about it for a minute. Oh, I'm very worried about people who are going to have to pay higher school fees. Couldn't give a fig about people who can't afford their heating bills, who can't pay their food bills. Absolutely unbelievable. If you're just tuning into this programme, I am taking the mickey out of people who say things like, get on your bike, get a better job, and if you can't afford it, don't have children. All right. I don't know that phone-ins all used to sound like that. Thankfully, they generally don't anymore. But that's the story. Labour would introduce a 20% VAT charge on private school fees immediately if it wins the general election, which means even in the next academic year, the higher charges could kick in. And I've got the politics out of the way now, because you might not like what I say next. Private education is fundamentally unfair. That is why we pay. It is a choice that is taken by people lucky enough to be in a position to make that choice, that giving their children a head start in life, an unfair head start in life, it would be stupid not to do it. If the head start is available, you would be stupid not to take it. Some people manage to be bigger and even more moral than that. The ones I think of first are actually Alistair Campbell and his wife Fiona Miller, who could obviously afford to send their children to private school but elected not to, and I think in Fiona's case got heavily involved in the governance of the school with the hope of pulling everybody with them on the path to improvement. My dad would come back from the grave and haunt me if I could afford to send my children to private school and didn't. He was, a man who valued education, partly because he didn't have much, left school at 15, but crucially understood, having ended up on the Daily Telegraph, the secret codes of class in this country. And for good or for ill, he wanted me to have the golden ticket that he didn't have. And guess what? It worked. Right? Dad, infinitely better journalist than me. In terms of measurable career success, I've done better than him. And I shouldn't have done, because he's a much, much, much better journalist than I would ever be, but I speak the lingo, right? I've got the moves, what they call the public school swagger. I know the people. I'm the kind of person when I meet somebody new and they say, what school did you go to? You don't say, why are you asking me what school I went to? You never would have heard of it. You say, well, I went to blah, blah, blah. And they say, oh, you must know. Blah, blah, blah. And I say, oh, yes, of course I do. I have to say his brother. Still playing cricket, is he? Marvellous. And it comes very naturally to me. I'm not ashamed of it or embarrassed by it. I'm proud of the effort and the energy that my parents put into giving me this wonderful, wonderful gift. But it probably shouldn't exist. And then I give it to my children while acknowledging that it probably shouldn't exist. You're quite right, Dad. I missed a bit. If you can't afford your school fees, just cancel your Netflix subscription and stop eating so many avocados on toast. So there it is. It shouldn't exist, but as long as it does exist, I'm having it. I'm having it for me and I'm having it for my kids, right? But here's the thing. Here's the thing I genuinely don't understand. Or rather, I understand it, but I don't have a neat answer to it. Because if you've got an unfair privilege, right, an unfair advantage, and don't waste tenpence calling me, well, you can't afford it actually, can you? But if you could afford it, don't waste tenpence calling me to tell me how hard you work to send your children to private school, because that's deeply insulting to people who work at least as hard as you do, but couldn't dream of finding 10, 15, 40,000 pound a year to educate their children. So it's got nothing to do with how hard you work. There are questions about prioritisation. Some people would rather drive a fancy car and go on foreign holidays than privately educate their children, but you're both privileged. You're just choosing to exercise your financial privilege in different ways. So don't waste tenpence calling me about that. Here's the bit I don't get. Here's the bit I really don't get, and it's philosophy, this. So you've got an unfair advantage that is currently enjoyed by, let us say, for the sake of argument, 10% of the population. 10% of this, a bit lower than that actually, but in order to do the sums that I'm going to need to do while building up this question, I'm sticking with 10% because it's nice and easily divisible. So 10% of the population enjoys an unfair advantage. 10% of the nation's children enjoy an unfair advantage. What's better, leaving it as it is or reducing it to 8% or 5%? You are not removing it. So the unfair advantage is still in place. Now, my dad absolutely of the view that if he can get me over that line, if he can get one of those golden tickets for his boy, then he's going to move heaven and earth to get it. And he is going to. I realised after he died and I went through his effects that he couldn't really afford it. Okay, breaks my heart that I cannot now turn around and, look after him a bit. Breaks my heart. Absolutely breaks my heart. He couldn't really afford it, but he did it. And I become one of the 10%. And I accrue and enjoy all the advantages that come with that. Not just the educational attainments. I'm the kind of kid who could quite easily have got lost in a comprehensive school because I was, as you could probably imagine, I was a prat as a teenager. And I revelled in not doing stuff. And I was lucky at my school to encounter amazing teachers who looked after me and saw through my foolishness and steered me until I got expelled, which is another illustration of me being a prat, just in case you thought I was exaggerating. And it didn't stop me. Even getting expelled from school in my final year didn't stop me from going to a brilliant university and enjoying a career that I thank the Lord every day for. Okay? None of it would have happened without the school that I went to, without the education that I got. I like to think it might have done. That's just arrogance. It wouldn't have done. Right? So that 10% includes me. And I think it is a good thing that I'm in it. And it's not just people like, I don't know, Zach Goldsmith and Jacob Rees-Mogg. I think it's a good thing that I got that golden ticket. I think the country is better off because a few people like me got that golden ticket rather than them just being handed down hereditarily. I don't think that's a word. I should get a refund on that term's fees. Rather than the golden tickets being handed down through a hereditary system to the children of the people who had golden tickets. My dad didn't have a golden ticket. He got one for me. He bought one for me. So what's better? If you're not getting rid of the golden ticket, what's better? 10% of the population having it and it therefore being accessible to people like us? Or 5% having it and it being accessible to nobody who hasn't got, let's just say, for the sake of argument, for a boarding school place, 50 grand, after tax, clear, per child. I don't know the answer to that, and I'm being desperately, brutally honest with you, because as with an awful lot of people who have a personal relationship with this issue, I don't know how much of my opinions are based upon my experiences and how much of them I would hold if I'd had very different experiences. And you could tell, because my voice broke, that when I think about what my dad did, it makes me cry. It makes my heart swell. And you will never change that. But neither will you ever change my view that these advantages shouldn't exist. They shouldn't be for sale. But if they are for sale, how can it be better for even fewer people than now to have access to them than yesterday? 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. It's 20 past 11. 23 minutes after 11 is the time. I don't know what the politics of it will be. I don't imagine that parents will be facing a 20% increase in their school fees. I think the school will absorb some of it. Some private schools, of course, are owned by investment vehicles. There's one in my neck of the woods that's been closed down with less than a term's notice for parents, presumably because the hedge fund or whatever you call it that owns it has decided they can make more money by building flats on the site. So, the politics of it. And all of the money that is raised by the increase on by charging VAT on school fees will go to the state education system. So it's win-win in one sense. But if an unfair advantage is available to 10% of the population, in the great scheme of things, is it better to leave it at 10 or to reduce it to, let's just say, 5 for the sake of argument? And I don't know the answer to that. Sarah is in High Wycombe. Sarah, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello,
so I'm a teacher. I'd like to tell you how it would work in our area if there was a 5% reduction in children able to attend private school. We've got a very big problem in Buckinghamshire with private schools poaching staff members from state schools at a time of a recruitment crisis.
Right, yes.
So we've recently had our caretaker poached by the local private school.
Caretaker?
My head teacher, our caretaker's been poached by the local, headhunted.
Yes.
Our head teacher is now cleaning the school because we can't recruit. My daughter's school, the physics department, almost the whole physics department, secondary school, was poached by the local private school. So we've lost those teachers. We're a grammar school area.
Yeah.
And what happens with the children who don't get selected for the grammar school is that a large number of these energetic, well-meaning parents send their children off to the local private school. So the comprehensive/secondary modern is deprived of a lot of enthusiastic parents who really care about their children's education. So in my area, if there was a 5% reduction in the number of children in private schools, it would be good news all around. It would be good news for the recruitment crisis that is facing the school where I teach. It would be good news for the parent-teacher associations, for the local secondary modern comprehensives, because they would get an influx of new parents. So all-round good thing here.
So we are battling, I am battling, this texter says, with the choice of personal benefits versus community benefits. You can't really argue with that, can you? And that's what you've just crystallised. It would be better for the community to have fewer people enjoying that unfair advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. And
what about the sense of hereditary privilege, though? What about the fact that the pyramid? It's almost like you'd be inserting a space where now the pyramid is solid. The chances of getting from the bottom 90% of it into the top, or the bottom 95% of it into the top 5%, is even smaller than it was before.
I think I've got a unique perspective on this because my husband works for an international company, and we're the sort of family that Liz Truss and now Kwarteng and now Rishi Sunak are trying to shower with money.
Yes.
So if they scrapped inheritance tax, we'd be cartwheeling all the way to the bank.
Right.
So I see that. But then I see what's happening in the school where I teach, where we have children who are sharing beds because they haven't got enough beds.
Yeah.
We've got families using food banks. We've got the system of special needs support collapsing. And I say, absolutely, bring it on with the tax on private school fees, because the needs of the community are much more important than the needs of these already wealthy families.
Okay, that's beautifully put, Sarah, and I thank you. I said that people would be unable to change my feelings on this issue, but I don't think I can necessarily say the same about my thoughts. 27 minutes after 11 is the time. Geordie's in Brussels. Geordie, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. Very nice talking to you.
Thank you.
I think that the first element to introduce in this conversation, I think that is also applicable to many other conversations, is one of conservative circles. If you think about yourself or your family, obviously the rational decision is to take to a private school. That is obvious. But then if you think in national terms, that changes, because what you're seeing is the effect in the rest of the country and in society as a whole. Same thing can apply if we talk about energy or the environment. Now, moving on to the education system, I think that there is one example, if I'm not mistaken, where they took this to the extreme, and that is Finland. And what they did was to simply abolish private education. So they said everyone's going to be through public education. This means that the policies of the government are geared towards benefiting all families and not just a few. Because the problem that we have in systems like in the UK, be it the 10% or the 5%, is that these 5 or 10% have an oversized influence in the policies of the country. So you can imagine that Eton is not going to have a problem with leaky rooftops like some of the schools now going on. So by diminishing from 10% to 5% or even more, you would create an incentive for public officials to make policies that benefit the whole of the country.
Yeah, that's a really good point as well. I think I'm on a hiding to nothing with this one. So it is as that texter said, it's the difference between the personal and the public. What's best for you as an individual, having access to private education will be an advantage that I can enjoy.
That is correct.
What's best for society, reduce it as much as you can. So even having it at 5% is better than having it at 10%.
That is correct. And this is why these discussions are so insidious, because both sides are correct.
Yes.
But it depends from which conceptual circle you are judging the situation.
Beautifully put.
The more you take, or the wider view you take, the more you have to look after the country instead of after a particular set of individuals.